Good morning, Mr. Pretorius. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Chair.
Thank you.
Morning, Chair. Morning, Mr. Gordhan.
Yes.
Minister Gordhan, just before we adjourned yesterday, we were dealing with the evidence that you were giving regarding Denel. And at paragraph 72 of your statement, you say that in the week before you were eventually dismissed as Finance Minister, litigation was launched by Denel against the Minister of Finance and National Treasury. We don't need to go into any detail there. It will be dealt with in other evidence, but just to inform the Chair and the Commission, the application brought by Denel was to ask the court to confirm that permission or approval of the joint project had been given by Treasury. That was opposed by Treasury and the application was unsuccessful. Is that summary correct?
Good morning, yes. That's a fair summary, and that Mr. Fuzile actually, after my departure from Treasury, lodged the affidavit on behalf of Treasury.
If we may then move to the 9th of December 2015 and what occurred on that day. Would you tell the Commission what you recollect of the events of the 9th of December 2015, please?
Certainly. Chairperson, at that stage, I was still the Minister responsible for COCTA. I didn't attend the meeting of the 9th of December of Cabinet. I think I wasn't well on that day. And heard later that evening that Mr. Nene was called back by the President after the meeting, the Cabinet meeting, at which the two things that are relevant there. The one was that the expectation was, as I explained yesterday, that at approximately the final meeting of Cabinet in each year, the allocations to each department are approved, and that apparently, which I learned later, was deferred to the first meeting in 2016, which took place, if I remember, on the 13th of January 2016. And the second matter of consequence was the question of the approval of a Cabinet memo in relation to the nuclear transaction. And upon his dismissal, we learn, as I think I indicate in that paragraph, that Mr. Van Rooyen, who until then I was familiar with as a member of the Finance Committee, the Standing Committee on Finance in Parliament, was appointed as the Finance Minister. And in paragraph 76, I indicate that on Thursday the 10th and Friday the 11th, the announcement of Mr. Nene's removal caused economic and financial market turmoil and a sharp depreciation of the value of the rand, which is an indicator of how the markets feel about both political and economic decisions that are being made in a country. And once markets closed for the weekend, there were ongoing fears that the situation would worsen when the markets reopened on Monday, the 14th of December. We then, in paragraph 77, look at the following 4 days, or rather the 4 days pursuant on the dismissal of Mr. Nene and his replacement by Mr. Van Rooyen, that this also resulted in a widespread public outcry. Civil society, organized labor, and organized business groups criticized the decision and demanded urgent corrective action by the then President Zuma.
Yes, before you go on, Minister, would you please turn to page 425 of the bundle. That's the first bundle, or bundle N1A. Statement by the former president, 3 paragraphs of which read, "On the 9th of December, I announced the appointment of a new Minister of Finance, David van Rooyen. I have received many representations to reconsider my decision," and then lower down, I have appointed Mr. Pravin Gordhan, the current Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, as the new Minister of Finance. In your statement at paragraph 78 and following, you deal with your involvement at the time in relation to the appointment of yourself as Minister of Finance. Would you relate that narrative, please, to the Chair?
Thank you, Chairperson. What paragraph 78 indicates is that because of my familiarity, having been there from 2009 to 2014, in the Ministry of Finance with the financial issues and economic issues, clearly the turmoil that we saw on that Thursday and Friday, the 10th and the 11th, would worry both myself but others who would appreciate what financial turmoil meant and what issues like the sharp depreciation of the rand, amongst other things, could result in as well. And this concern I expressed to Ms. Kaunda, to whom I suggested that a team consisting of the Presidency, the Reserve Bank, the Treasury, and the private sector, even over the weekend if need be, find ways of communicating with investors the decision of the President and attempt in some way to calm the situation down. Precisely how, I don't know, but I thought communication per se and being in contact with key stakeholders, for example, investors, as I explained yesterday, in our bonds, would give them an appreciation, hopefully, that there's some wisdom underpinning the decision. And securing the well-being of the economy and the country and saving the South African population from the worst effects of some of that turmoil would be far more important than trying to ask the question and get answers to why the change, which in any event might have been speculative at that point in time. And all of this arose, as I indicated earlier on, in anticipation of the Monday morning, the 14th of December, that if the Thursday and Friday pattern, which I'll come back to in a moment, is to continue and worsen in the week starting on the 14th of December, then there could be fairly serious consequences for the economy and for the credit rating, which I explained yesterday as well, and I'm sure we'll return to in a moment. So my primary concern, as I indicate in paragraph 78, was the need for urgent measures to address the economic and financial harm caused since the announcement of Mr. Nene's removal, while at the same time remaining conscious that such matters relating to the Treasury were not within the brief of COCTA. In other words, I'm a former minister, I'm not the Minister of Finance, and that I needed to be aware, Chairperson, of that. But that shouldn't stop one from expressing concern as a member of government about what had just happened.
What was the estimate at the time of the...
Mr. Pretorius.
I'm sorry, DC.
I'm sorry. To what extent were the suggestions and ideas that you communicated to the Presidency over those 2 or 3 days in terms of what should be done, to what extent were they influenced also? I'm sure they were influenced by your own concern and your own desire to make a contribution to what was a crisis, but to what extent were they also informed maybe by any contact by investors and other stakeholders, both within the country and outside of the country, who may have thought that since the Minister Nene had been removed, you having been his predecessor, maybe you were the one person they could think of as the person to talk to, as immediate former Minister of Finance that they could talk to and maybe say what's happening and something should be done?
I can't recall any direct contact with myself, but what I can certainly recall, well, before I get to that, the other point, Chair, is that officials in the Treasury might well have been contacted by bond investors and so on, and saying what's going on. And again, when Mr. Fuzile appears before you, he can shed some light on that matter. Because we're used to the idea in the Treasury of, for example, in addition to shows that we have teleconferences with rating agencies or groups of investors, or we get invited by one or other financial institution, which have the capacity sometimes of getting up to 200 to 300 investors on a single call. So they have the technology from east to west of the world, getting everybody on the same call. They can take questions, we answer them. And I've done that both from South Africa, but I've done that from other parts of the world as well, when these financial institutions host us to meet these investors. In parallel with that, what became clear is that there was a fair amount of activity, and some of it I might have learned after the fact, amongst business people and some of the cabinet colleagues, or people in the ANC senior ranks, who were called upon by the business sector to say, basically, what are you guys up to, if I may use a colloquialism, and that those interactions also would have been a channel through which business and others could express their concerns about what actually happened. Now, one will have to have a researcher to work out which particular set of events eventually resulted in what happened on the evening of the 13th of December. But clearly, some of the senior colleagues and comrades within the ANC ranks were very aware of the consequences of what was going on, and would have evaluated the different types of feedback that they were receiving, and then decided to, it would appear, approach the President on this matter. It was a fairly unique event, if you like, in our more recent past, where you have this kind of turmoil following a political decision.
Well, I was about to ask whether you are able to indicate whether maybe post-94, whether there had ever been any event to which the markets reacted so negatively in the country. You might or might not be able to say so, but let me ask.
Not with any great authority, Chair, but I would doubt it. So some of the big events we've had, if you like, is the introduction of gear during President Mandela's term, the Asian financial crisis in 98, 99, which also Minister Manuel and others had to deal with, the departure in 2008 of President Mbeki and his replacement by President Motlanthe would have been another one. But in each of those situations, I would imagine the kind of turmoil and concerns that were expressed in this context would not have been seen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Minister, do you know of any other senior members of the ANC who would have acted similarly to how you acted, as you described now?
Yeah, well, eventually, as my narrative continues, you will see that the current president, Mr. Ramaphosa, and the Deputy Secretary General certainly got involved. I think the Secretary General himself, Mr. Mantashe, was involved in some way. The Treasurer General of the time, Mr. Mkhize, and one or two other cabinet colleagues might have been involved as well.
We'll get to that narrative in a moment. And do you know of any senior members of the governing party who were approached by business, formally or informally? I know it's a very general question and a difficult question to
I think
answer.
some of the names I've mentioned might have had interactions with business. But there was no doubt that the business sector, and perhaps you should call them as well and ask them directly. If you take the financial institutions, the leadership of business organizations at the time, how did they experience this period? So they can tell you what their concerns were and what were the measures or reactions that came from their particular constituencies in respect of this matter, because there certainly were engagements, but it could mean that one ANC person met 5 business people on one occasion, another met another 10 people on another occasion, or whatever the case might be. My tendency is to stay away, not to, if you like, poke my nose into those matters unless I have to. So I've declared the manner in which I've expressed my concern at that particular time. But there's no doubt that there was a hype of activity during that weekend.
The estimated impact on the South African economy in financial terms, what was that over that weekend beginning 9 December 2015?
Well, in paragraph 79, Chair, we give you some indication of numbers. And this is not the weekend, this is just 2 business days, Thursday and Friday, the 10th and the 11th of December 2015. And what we say here is the devastating impact of this unexpected announcement on the South African economy is estimated to be approximately 500 billion rands. This covers the following 2 amounts. As commentators and market analysts had described over 2 days, the market value of the country's 17 biggest financial and property shares fell by 290 billion rands. So if you tried to extract your pensions at that point in time, the value of the investments, which is normally around 60% in shares, for most pension funds, would have dropped quite substantially, as this number is indicating. This figure excludes the remainder of the equities market that also was hit hard by the decision. And then the South African bonds lost 12% of their capital value, and that amounted to the 216 billion number. We've deleted the last sentence of paragraph 79, but when checking with Bloomberg, from the 9th of December in the evening to the 11th of December, if we track the rand, Chairperson.
Can I refer you in that regard to page 140 of the supplementary bundle, where the calculations of your legal team are set out? That's bundle N.
What's the page number?
140. Bundle N2.
N2.
Yes, Chair. They should now be marked. It's the supplementary bundle.
I've got the supplementary bundle, but it doesn't go, or does go as far as
Right towards the back, Chairperson.
you said 142, eh?
140.
140. Oh, okay, I've got it.
Yes, Minister.
No, thank you for directing me to this page. So, Chair, as you see there, on Wednesday, the 9th of December, at 8 in the evening, the rand was trading at 14.59 to the dollar, US dollar. The announcement of Mr. Van Rooyen's appointment was made at 11 in the evening of the 9th. On the 10th at midnight, the rand was at 15.25. Then the average for, the 10th was 15.27, and on the 11th, it was 15.90. So clearly, if that pattern is to be followed, there would be a further deterioration on Monday of the 14th, if we use that just as one of the indicators.
Would you then please deal with the events of Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, and your interaction with the former president in particular?
I'm sorry. Before Mr. Pretorius directed you to the page you have just dealt with in the other bundle, you were saying something in regard to the last sentence of paragraph 79. I just want to make sure that I understand. I think you have completed it, but I just want to make sure, because you were referring to the last sentence of paragraph
yes.
79.
I was reminding ourselves, Chair, that yesterday, as part of corrections, what stood as the last sentence previously, the rand depreciated sharply, was deleted.
Oh, that
so the new numbers on page 140 of the bundle replaces those numbers.
Okay, thank you.
Then, if you will, Minister Gordhan, would you deal with the events of Sunday, 13 December 2015, and in particular your interactions with the former president?
So in paragraph 81, Chair, perhaps if I may, with your permission, round up the last part. What does that impact mean for the South African public? And I indicated that one of the impacts for working people who save their pensions, money in various forms of pension funds or other forms of investments, and usually there's 50 to 60% of that put into the equity markets, or shares as we call them, there would have been a substantial decline in the value of those shares, and therefore the value of the pension. What we don't have here, but which your team could get, Chairperson, is the drop in the value of the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation investments at the time as well. That was also a very good indicator. I think they lost 50 billion or something in a day, if not more. But I don't want to swear by that. But it's a number that your team could check with the PIC itself. So for so-called ordinary South Africans, the first impact is on their savings. The second is that if that turmoil continued, then pretty much as we see today, even if oil prices are fairly static, and if the rand begins to head in this sort of direction of 15, 19, 90, 16 rand, 1650, then, and as you know, we import our oil largely, except for what Sasol produces. That means the price of petrol and diesel is a cost that the citizen has to pay, as we've learned over the past few months as well. If that continues for a substantial enough period, these price increases then filter into the economy more generally. Transport costs increase, and if you talk to the Reserve Bank, they could give you their perspective on this as well. And their perspective would be whether these price increases then begin to impact on the inflation rate. And if they do, then you could get an increase in the interest rates. And if you do, then the money that you've borrowed for your car or for your home or whatever the case might be is a lot more expensive than you originally thought. So you could have borrowed at 10% to 12%, and suddenly it shoots up by 0.5% or whatever the case is. And depending on the value of your loan, it becomes an additional burden, this increase in interest rates as well. So you can see how this economic cycle works. And I'm an amateur at that, but I'm sure you can get a professional to come and explain to you what the impact is. So it affects ordinary South Africans, these sorts of decisions that we make. And obviously the kind of concern shown by different constituencies during that critical weekend of the 12th and 13th was absolutely justified. And I'm not saying that my appointment was justified. I'm just saying the concern was justified. But we'll come back to that in a moment.
Well, you might wish to deal with this maybe later on after you have dealt with the events of Sunday the 13th and maybe even Monday. But I do want to know whether that kind of lost value in terms of pensions and so on would be recovered or recouped as soon as the rand came back, or whether in terms of economics and finances it would necessarily be like that, and whether after some time from that time whatever value had been lost during that weekend has actually been rectified. So, but it's a question you can deal with when it fits into what you want to talk about.
Sure. Only safe to add, Chair, that the immediate attention in these sorts of situations is given to stabilizing the environment so that the trough doesn't continue, you plateau at some level, and then the recovery process starts. But again, if your team speaks to the Joburg Stock Exchange, for example, they'll give you the actual numbers of the time and what the recovery takes. Okay. So coming back to Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, as I indicate in paragraph 81, in the late afternoon of Sunday, the 13th of December 2015, I received a message from Ms. Kaunda requesting my attendance at a meeting with former President Zuma to be held at Mashlambo and Ndlovu later that evening. At around the same time, Ms. Jessie Duarte, the Deputy Secretary General of the ANC, contacted me explaining that I was going to be asked to do something by former President Zuma. As I recall it, no detail was given to me, and that I should not refuse the request.
You say no detail was given, Minister. Was she told what you would be asked to do, or were you told?
Well, retrospectively, yes.
But at this stage?
All I was told is, please don't refuse. They must have known that I was enjoying my job at Kokta, but we'll come back to that. I received a similar message from the Deputy President of the ANC and of the country at the time, Mr. Ramaphosa.
Again, were you given any detail?
No detail. Safe to say that please don't refuse. I believe Ms. Duarte and then Deputy President Ramaphosa had met with former President Zuma over the weekend regarding his surprise removal of Mr. Nene and the appointment of Mr. Van Rooyen. I arrived at the President's residence at about 18:30, as I indicate in paragraph 85. And at 85:1...
Sorry, again, before you go on, Minister, was anyone else present at that meeting?
No, it was just, well, in the room itself, only the two of us. He had his staff outside of the room. During that conversation, former President Zuma indicated that he was of the view that Mr. Van Rooyen was suitable for the finance minister position. I think he said he checked his CV with various people, and he seemed to be fine. But that, and I continue with paragraph 85:1. So let me just read it again.
In other words, did President Zuma place any expectation on how you would conduct yourself as Minister of Finance?
No. I think the urgency was just to get my appointment done and the public informed so that whatever effects were anticipated for Monday the 14th would begin to take place.
Yes. You deal later with a further conversation you had with the President, but just to deal with certain speculation, if I may, that certain conditions were placed by the former President or certain demands were made or a deal was done. What is your response to that?
Yes, no, thank you for raising that, and if I may take a few liberties in this regard, because
Thank you.
speculations either within the Commission or outside is a poor substitute for facts from me appearing right before you. So the first point I want to make is that I was surprised that he was asking me and that others were asking me to take this job again. Having just been removed in 2014 from this position of Minister of Finance. Secondly, I've never lobbied for any job, including this one. So let me make it very clear. And this is linked to the point I want to make. For me, politics is not a career. I'm not tied to earning my income by being a member of parliament or by being a cabinet minister. It was a calling. And one can walk out and look for a job elsewhere if the need arises. So that's the third point. The fourth is that I didn't actually want to change jobs. We were just beginning to get to terms with the difficulties that municipalities were facing. We had developed an analytical methodology, Chairperson, at the time, which Minister Mkhize inherits today. And that enabled us to understand which were the functional municipalities, which were the dysfunctional municipalities, and which municipalities, as the third group, would have some hope if we intervened in a technical sense. We also spent a lot of time visiting municipalities and understanding what goes wrong in places that do go wrong, whether it's Oudtshoorn at that point in time, or Mokolokwena in Limpopo, or other places in the country as well. So what was a fairly dysfunctional department was beginning to come together, and the back to basics concept was created. The President had actually, I can't remember the date, but addressed a back to basics conference of mayors and speakers and so on, and municipal managers prior to this particular occasion arising. So, and all of that was in order, let me be frank, to place the ANC in a position where in the 2016 municipal elections it would do better than it would have otherwise. So that was certainly the intention. So in that sense, I didn't want to actually get into changing jobs at that point in time. The point that relates more directly to what Mr. Pretorius asks, Chairperson, is that I don't make deals for jobs. I don't need to. I have my own humble beginnings as just a pharmacist. I think in 1974, my first salary was 100 rands or 125 rands. That looks funny today, but that's where we started. And certainly I don't make deals with smugglers or taxpayers or submit to intimidation or bullying of any kind. The last point I want to make in this regard is that as far as I'm concerned, I'm accountable to citizens of this country, as you pointed out yesterday, who actually elect us into Parliament. Then Parliament as an institution, because I'm an executive in this government. Of course, I'm accountable to the political organization that has enabled me to play this kind of role, but I'm not accountable to bullies in any way whatsoever. And I believe, if I may take the liberty to say so, Chair, that those who are making the accusations that they are, or these allegations, either outside of this forum or elsewhere, should, under oath, come to commissions like this one, and this one in particular, and say what they have to say, and subject themselves to cross-examination if need be. I've appeared before your colleague, former Judge Nugent, said what I had to say under oath there. I'm appearing before you and saying what I have to say under oath, and I'm not fearful of any contradiction in that regard. So thank you for the opportunity just to clarify those issues.
Thank you.
I'm not a commodity for sale. And I think the Guptas learned that too.
Minister, the conversation continued, or a different conversation followed, where you raised certain issues with the former president. What was the context of that discussion, and what was the content of that discussion?
Yeah, I'm just trying to track that paragraph.
You're dealing with paragraph 88.
88. So, Chair, as the in the paragraph before that indicates, I said my first response to the President was, as I indicated, you have other people you could appoint to this position. I'm enjoying what I'm doing. I also might have said, and I did say, by the way, well, you moved me in the first place from the job, so why do you want me back there? And then I said I needed to consult my family, which I did. And despite our collective reluctance, we said the country being where it is and the kind of difficulties that we're facing, let's give the commitment to serve in this capacity again, which we did. And when I finally communicated to the President that I would accept his proposition, I said there are 3 issues which we need to discuss. They weren't discussed that evening, but I put them on the table. The first is as I indicated in 88.1, the ongoing dire financial predicament of SAA, and specifically the role of the chair of the board, Ms. Mieni. Now you'll recall that SAA up to the 2014 elections was within the public enterprises portfolio. He had hinted during that period, slightly before the elections, that he wants to transfer it to Treasury to sort it out. I think there were some difficulties between Minister Gigaba and Ms. Mieni, which I think is on the record publicly as well. Secondly, I think Minister Nene might have indicated to you that the SAA is then transferred to Treasury during his term post the 2014 elections. So thirdly, if I get back to Treasury, I'm inheriting SAA and the kind of difficulties that SAA has on the one hand, but particularly the role of the chair on the other hand. 88.2 is the second item which I indicated that we needed to discuss, which yesterday I showed that the conversation started before the 2014 elections, and that is the proposed nuclear procurement deal. And the concern there was a very similar one as the one I expressed on that occasion, which is, can we have a proper procurement process, and can we ensure that fiscally we can afford whatever it is that we agree to purchase in the nuclear field, but obviously recognizing, as I said yesterday, that there are various providers on the one hand and stakeholders like environmental groups and civil society organizations on the other hand. The third was the issue of Mr. Moyane's role as the SARS commissioner, and this arises from the fact that I think from about the last quarter of 2014 and into 2015, you've had a number of leaks to the Sunday Times in particular, for which they've subsequently apologized, in relation to an investigation unit that was set up within the Revenue Service, which Judge Nugent has been looking at, but in a much broader context. So those were the 3 issues, Mr. Pretorius, that I indicated we needed to chat further. He nodded his head and said, yes, we'll talk about it.
So apart from placing those issues on the agenda, as it were any substantive agreements reached or understandings reached about how those problems would be addressed?
No. I was anticipating that at least having placed these issues on the table, that at some stage or the other we would begin to talk about them in a systematic way. Some we did, some we didn't, in the short period thereafter.
At page 425 of the bundle is the press release that was issued. You've already dealt with that. I understand from your statement that you assisted in the drafting of that statement.
Yeah, my concern and the Treasury officials' concern would have been, if we've got the same printout, the bottom part of page 425. And I think it's perhaps important to look at it carefully. So remember again, the context, Chairperson, is turmoil, concerns about nuclear, concerns that we might be overstepping the mark in terms of fiscal affordability, and then finally, as a result of Mr. Nene's dismissal, a very great concern about the economic management as a whole. So you will see that he will lead the government again in the following: ensuring an even stronger alignment between the budget and the medium-term strategic framework, which I referred to yesterday, in the interest of stimulating more inclusive growth and accelerated job creation, while continuing the work of ensuring that our debt is stabilized over the medium term. Promoting, this is the second bullet point, and promoting and strengthening the fiscal discipline and prudence that has characterized our management of public finances since the dawn of freedom. Third bullet point, working with the financial sector so that its stability is preserved under the broad umbrella of the Twin Peaks reform. And fourth, ensuring that the National Treasury is more acceptable to all sections of our society. And adherence to the set expenditure ceiling while maintaining a stable trajectory of our debt portfolio as set out in the February 2015 budget. So if you go through that, Chair, and these were some of the issues that I covered yesterday, you will recall. The first bullet point is the alignment, if I may explain, between the budget and the medium-term strategic framework, which is crafted on the basis of the governing party's manifesto once an election is over. And clearly the key concern in that period, because by 2015 growth was beginning to decline. We had a sharp downturn, 2009, 10, and part of 11, slight uptick thereafter, and then a decline again, which we've never quite recovered from. And that's why the emphasis on more inclusive growth, and clearly in our context where we have such high unemployment, accelerated job creation would be quite important as well. But equally important in the last of the line, on the last or the second last line of the first bullet point, and you'll notice we make reference to debt twice, right? So there we talk about our debt is stabilized over the medium term, meaning that for a while the debt curve, and if you look at the budget reviews, you'll see graphs that reflect this, the debt curve has been moving that way. And what we're saying is that it needed to taper off before you get anywhere near 60%, as I was explaining yesterday.
On the face of it, this part that you have just talked through now would reasonably be expected to mean that when it came to the is it the energy deal? When it came to that therefore your view about costs would be given due weight.
Yes.
Thank
well,
you.
In this context, it had to be.
Yeah. Okay.
It had to be. So if you look at the second point, Chair, promoting and strengthening the fiscal discipline and prudence. So there was already concern amongst rating agencies and so on, and it's a point that is picked up on the next page when we refer to the expenditure ceiling. So we've created a concept or a virtual ceiling, if you like, as government, not as but on Treasury's proposal, which says that don't try to cross the, I think it's a 30% barrier. And whatever you want to do within that envelope that's actually available. And that provided a lot of assurance to bond investors and others that we were maintaining an appropriate fiscal trajectory whilst attending to whatever the issues were that we were facing at the time. And the emphasis on prudence would be with reference to issues like nuclear on the one hand, but a general mindset in terms of how we spend the money and resources that we have. And the third bullet point is work with the financial sector. And the importance here is that the financial sector is the sector that gets, was firstly fairly secure during the after effects or the ripples that we had from the Wall Street Great Recession beginning to impact on the rest of the world. And as I indicated yesterday, that arising from the experience of the financial crisis, there was a G20 discussion and process which said that the way in which the financial sector is regulated needs to change, and that began to introduce the Twin Peaks concept, the Twin Peaks policy document, and today we actually have legislation in place as well. So there's been, for example, an insurance company that's been in the news for the last 48 to 72 hours. Its prudential regulation is now, as I said yesterday, under the Reserve Bank, but its market conduct, that means the way in which it behaves towards customers, is part of this new body, I forget its name now, which is a successor to the Financial Services Board. And ensuring the National Treasury is more acceptable, I think arises from the fact that sometimes we had detractors who would undermine the credibility of the Treasury. And it is in these instances where external investors and businesses generally, small and big, would be looking for signals of stability by looking at what happens in the Treasury environment. So instability in the Treasury, politically or otherwise, sends the wrong kind of signals about how we're managing the resources in our country. And the last bullet point on page 426 refers to what I said earlier on, the expenditure ceiling and maintaining a stable trajectory of debt, so that debt is mentioned for the second time. In other words, we made certain undertakings in the February budget of 2015, we'll stick to it. And that's the commitments that help to reassure South Africans and investors that we were doing the right thing.
You've touched on it, Minister, in your last portion of your current answer. It may be assumed that the same or similar principles of fiscal discipline were being followed by your predecessor, Minister Nene at the time, before his dismissal. What was the purpose of the statement then, just generally, in relation to the current situation at the time in December 2015, and of the reassurances?
Well, this is not... there was another statement which we must look for, which is relevant to your question as well, which is not covered here, which is the reason given for Mr. Nene's dismissal, which he would have covered in his evidence, that he was going to be assigned to a BRICS job. There was no such job. I was one of the initiators of the BRICS Bank concept and the institution, so there was absolutely not a job which is commensurate with what someone like Mr. Nene has to actually offer within the BRICS Bank, or what is called the New Development Bank today. So that's the first. The second is what the latter part of the statement. Because remember, the purpose of bringing about the changes on the 13th of December was to help to reassure markets on Monday, the 14th of December. And so that's the kind of statement that a president needs to issue, to say, I've got the situation under control, this new minister is going to do exactly what we have been doing and have been promising to do, and that's the explicit message. But the implicit message is, as you were saying, Chair, that we're not going to blow the budget on nuclear or any such project.
I know that you did suggest other names when you were approached for reappointment as Minister of Finance, but it just seems to me that it made perfect sense to reappoint somebody who had been to the portfolio, and you had been there for a full 5 years, I think, full 5 years, and the markets knew your views, they knew you, and also, I guess, in this kind of situation, nobody would want somebody who must come in and still learn. You needed somebody that really knew what needed to be done. I know that you might find that you are not able to say anything about this, but it seems to me that it made sense if the situation was to be stabilized urgently.
Well, let's take it as academic speculation, Chair, but you could have recalled Mr. Manuel, who was the longest-serving finance minister, I think, in the world at one stage, of 13 years.
But had he not left on the basis that he had served too long?
Yeah. Then you've had Mr. Jonas, who was then the deputy minister. So he already understood what that ministry was doing and what the Treasury was doing. And I think they had already crossed one budget cycle, plus the MTBPS of 2015. That would have been October 2015. And have been very much into the preparations for budget 2016 by the time these events unfolded. And as I said, Mr. Moleketi was there for a full, most of a term, not a full term, as I recall it, because he departed at the same time as Mr. Mbeki. But academically, those were possibilities.
Thank you.
Minister Gordhan, what did you do as your first tasks? What were the first tasks that you performed on your reappointment? You deal with that in paragraph 92.
So that's Monday morning, Chair. Well, first thing before Monday was that I informed the DG in the Treasury that I would be coming in. And I informed the DG in COCTA that I would be leaving as a courtesy. And possibly the deputy ministers in the COCTA environment, but I'm not too clear on that. But I think I met them on Monday morning. So as I indicate in paragraph 92, those were some of the interactions I've had. In 92.1 is the Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. Jonas, to discuss the urgent and significant tasks that we faced, the National Treasury team, so that I could be briefed on the preparations for the 2016 budget, as I indicated earlier on, Mr. Moyane at SARS, regarding 10 issues which I considered important, and they're covered in an email which he sent to me on the basis of our discussion. That's at Annexure 19 and at page 428 of the first bundle. And then, as a courtesy, met Minister Van Rooyen, I think after he was sworn in, to give him a very brief oversight on what's happening in COCTA, so that he could adapt to the new environment. The first 2 points are quite important here, 92.1 and 92.2. As I explained, the preparations for a budget technically start in about July, August each year, when officials start interacting or set out the parameters, following a discussion in a subcommittee of cabinet called the Ministers' Committee on the Budget, MINCOM-BUD as we refer to it, And departments then receive a circular which says these are the parameters within which the next budget cycle is possibly going to operate. For example, we might even tell them at that stage, you've got to restrain your expenditure on personnel or whatever the case might be in order to prepare them in respect of their numbers. But inevitably, you always get an oversubscribed set of requests. If your budget is R1 trillion, it could be oversubscribed by about 300 to 400 billion rands, and then the tough task of managing the allocations process as well. Secondly, at about this time, we begin to look at the decision that South Africans often look forward to but don't like, which is tax. So what are the options on the tax side? So you'll recall yesterday we said that in the framework of the budget, there's the revenue side and there's the expenditure side. So I've described the expenditure side, but the revenue side is quite important. And by this time in December, we might have the most recent numbers from the SARS collections as well, and we wait for the next set of numbers and at the end of January to give us a more accurate feel for what the tax receipts are likely to be and what percentage increase year on year we're likely to get. And they could vary around the 9% mark historically. So those tax decisions would be quite important. You know, do you increase VAT or not? Do you establish or set up a new bracket of 45% that I suppose a number of people here fall into and pay? And that occupied us for 2 or 3 years before we made the final decision to actually set up or put in place the 45% bracket. Where else do we find money? So transfer fees, as far as property sales is concerned, is another area that we look at. The other part, which is quite popular, is what would be the excise duty increases in cigarettes or alcohol as well, and what are the new taxes, if any. So from time to time, we would look at whether the carbon tax should be introduced or not introduced. There are positives and negatives on that. An example of a new tax could be a new levy on, for example, the plastic bags that we're now all very familiar with, which brings in 1 or 2 billion rands as well. And so each year, the Minister of Finance has to look into those sorts of issues, which I imagine is currently happening in the Treasury as well. And if you recall, I said that at the last meeting of the 9th of December, the final allocations to departments were not decided, as they usually are, but carried forward to the 13th of January, the first cabinet meeting in the following year. So that left a bit of uncertainty about what the allocations would actually look like. So there were fairly substantial issues that needed to be attended to, and when we come to SAA, we'll pick up on one of the, what shall we call it, procurement issues that we ran into as well.
Mr. Gordhan, we return now to the period which your statement covers, and that is your second term as Minister of Finance, against the background of the original purpose of your evidence, which is to outline those issues or circumstances which were prevalent, which may have been relevant to the appointment and dismissals of ministers, particularly yourself. And you start on page 34 of your statement, of the statement bundle, N1A, with South African Airways. Would you outline the circumstances prevalent in relation to South African Airways at the time? It still, at that time, fell under Treasury, I understand.
Yes.
And it was part of your portfolio.
That's correct. So, Chair, as paragraph 93 indicates, and I'll read some of this onto the record and then explain some of the issues. The financial and governance challenges experienced by SAA in recent years are no doubt well known to the Commission. At the time that I was reappointed Minister of Finance, an immediate priority was dealing with the proposed restructuring of a deal that had been approved by Mr. Nene and Airbus, in terms of which SAA would swap the purchase of 10 A320 aircraft for a lease of 5 330-300 aircraft from Airbus. So this is the famous Airbus swap deal, as we might call it.
What was the rationale of that swap and replacing the original purchase with the swap? Are you able to
I can't remember
say?
the detail, but I think the one, as you know, a purchase would require an upfront capital outlay, which I don't think we had, and SAA certainly didn't have at that time. And a lease would be payment over a period of time, and many airlines today lease rather than purchase aircraft. But one of the things we're learning, Chair, is that in the context of all the instability and difficulties that SAA is facing, leasing at this stage of a transaction is fine. But one of the conditions that lessors add to any leasing agreement is that when you want to hand the aircraft back, then it must be in the condition you received it in. So you've actually got to spend money refurbishing an aircraft before you return it. So it sounds easy in the first stage because you spend your money over a period of time. Others enter into other kinds of agreements as well, where, as I learned in Singapore recently by talking to some of the agencies there, where you build, and I think some of the bigger airlines in the world, the Middle Eastern ones in particular, have, if you like, a recycling agreement that after every 6 or 7 years, they have an agency to which they give the aircraft and then acquire new aircraft. And the older aircraft is then either sold or leased on, and because they are big buyers of aircrafts, they can have particular deals with Airbus or Boeing or whatever the case might be. But the point I want to make here is that in the current debates that we are having, this is one of the cost factors that needs to be taken into account.
As I understand from the evidence of Mr. Nene, the original agreement required the payment of large pre-delivery amounts, and as a result of the swap to a lease agreement, the airline then would be excused from making those payments.
Yeah, there was an amount of $40 million.
Yes. You deal with that in paragraph 94,
which we come to in a moment.
You should deal with it there.
At paragraph 94, the then chairperson of SAA, Ms. Mieni, however, wished to amend the swap transaction to allow SAA to purchase the aircraft and enter into a sale and leaseback deal with local businesses.
Now, we've been curious to try and discover who those businesses or what those businesses were. Do you have any knowledge of those businesses?
No, but I think we can find out, Chair, from SAA, not offhand. But essentially, this is that same concept I described yesterday in relation to SAA Technical, where a interlocutor, if you like, or middle person, is put into the supply chain process. Although here, in a different way. Now imagine you buy the aircraft, you then lease it, and then bring it back onto your service, and you pay all the costs that are involved, including the profit that the lessor in this case would actually make out of this process as well. So I'm sure there's a forensic report lying around somewhere which would explain potential malfeasance in this particular instance as well. But it meant, as Mr. Pretorius points out, and I'll come to it in a moment.
I just wanted to go back to this condition that the aircraft, when you have leased it, must be returned in the condition that it was in when you leased it. Would that have been subject to normal wear and tear? Because otherwise it just seems to me it's rather unfair on the lessee if it's not subject to normal wear and tear, Means you lease it for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you give this lessor something that he or she would not have had if the aircraft had stayed with them.
So I think some things are allowable, if you like, and some things have to be returned to the original condition. But we can get you the details if you're interested.
Okay, all right.
Minister, do you have any detail of the sale and lease agreement? It's described as a sale and lease back deal. Presumably the aircraft would be purchased by SAA, on-sold to local businesses, and then leased back to SAA. Are there any further details as to...
I'm sure the Treasury Chairperson would have the details.
Thank you.
So the proposed pre-delivery payments, which we referred to a moment ago, of approximately $40 million and approximately 603 million rands at that time, under that proposal would likely have triggered debt defaults by SAA because they wouldn't have had that kind of cash available to them, due to the pressure these payments would have placed on SAA's cash resources, cross defaults on other leasing arrangements, and the probable triggering of government-guaranteed debt obligations would likely have followed.
Is that the circumstance you explained yesterday of cross guarantees?
That's the point I was going to make in a moment. That once you trigger those cross defaults, and it begins to affect all the other lending agreements that you might have entered into. This would have had severe consequences for SAA and the country as a whole. So if you take this as a package, there's a fairly responsible decision taken to undertake the swap. We didn't have the money to pay the $40 million at the time, or SAA didn't have the money. Despite that, they were trying to pursue the sale and leaseback scheme that would have had its own cost implications as well, and that potentially, if sufficient regard was not had to the amount of cash available to SAA to pay these amounts, then you would get into that cross-default situation that government obviously doesn't want to find itself in. At 95, in late December 2015, while driving on the N2 highway in Cape Town, I received a phone call from the former president inquiring whether we could do what Ms. Mieni wanted with respect to the Airbus deal. I explained that we could not, since the fiscus could not afford the pre-delivery payments, and the penalties would follow if we undertook her proposal. It was clear to me that Ms. Mieni had contacted the former president and that had prompted his call to me. 96, I afforded SAA the opportunity to make further representations to National Treasury regarding Ms. Mieni's proposal, following which I decided in late December 2015 that the swap transaction should go ahead as had been approved by Mr. Nene in July 2015. Prior to my appointment as Minister of Finance, the National Treasury had been working on the process of appointing a new SAA board, as outlined in Mr. Nene's statement to the Commission. Progress was slow, and I understand that eventually the engagements between officials from the Presidency and from National Treasury produced a list of individuals to be appointed to the board. A compromise was reached that Ms. Mieni would only continue as chairperson of the board for a further year. So there's, in relation to the swap arrangement, Chairperson, despite the fact that we were quite convinced in the Treasury that this was heading in the wrong direction, we gave SAA the opportunity to make representations to persuade the Treasury that they would have had the money and that the kind of scheme that they wanted to enter into was one that would not be detrimental to both SAA and the state.
Who made those representations? Was it SAA board, SAA executive?
Again, I don't have the details. I was on semi-leave at the time, so the officials at the Treasury dealt with that. I think Mr. Momoniat was acting Director General during that period. But I somehow recall also that I had to speak to the Airbus people directly in Paris to reassure them, because we were heading for some kind of deadline, by which time we had to make up our minds on the swap agreement. And just to assure them that there was a process underway, and it might have been very close to the 20th or so of December, by which time a letter was formally sent to them that we agree with the swap agreement and not any other alternative. And they were quite willing to accept our reassurances.
That last sentence in paragraph 97, a compromise was reached, suggests that there may have been some among those who may have been talking who wanted Ms. Mieni to not to continue, but there may have been others who wanted her to continue. Am I right? And are you able to talk on that?
No, you're right, and I was going to come back to 97 as a whole, Chair, to explain both that and the fact that this sounds very smooth in 97, but it's a process, as I recall it, and I was reading this in one of the transcripts that the Commission had provided with the previous public protector. This took about 6 to 7 months. So for 6 months at least, we had paralysis, because the President and the Treasury had different views about who would constitute the board. Largely, I think on the other side, led by Ms. Mieni's own approach to who she would prefer on the board. And eventually, this discussion that we indicate here between the Presidency officials and National Treasury officials brought together, if you like, 2 lists and gave us the board that emerged. And then you're correct, this last sentence does reflect the fact that there was some debate about whether Ms. Mieni continues at all as a member of the board, or whether she continues for the next 3 years as a chair of the board, and then the compromise of 1 year emerged in that context.
The matter is dealt with in documents in the supplementary bundle, and perhaps we can address those after the short adjournment with the leave of the chair. Thank you.
We'll take the tea adjournment. We'll resume at 11:30.
So you'll still go back to this later on?
What were you saying when I gave you the note?
No, I was saying not another note.
No, I was.
Look at this. I got on a groot druk.
I'm trying to be precise in the question.
At least you can do
Don't kill me. I'm going to kill
taken the plaque for your misdemeanors.
Mugwena doesn't want to be associated in any way whatsoever. You should be here. I'm coming.
No.
I'm gonna pass whatever food is from this side. Can I have my this way? Mento is still going to come back now that she has retracted. Exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But we still call him back. But we put this one in for now.
Yeah, and he must say in the supplementary. I think that was, or we picked up with us. And we asked him to
Or on the day, he can clarify his statement.
No, I think let's take forward.
Yeah, supplementary.
No. I did not pick up the...
And better show. Show.
I did not pick up the...
When the crunch time comes,
Anxieties and... Why? Why Friday afternoon? Me. And then it's going to fly back.
Hello? What are you?
why can't we just forfeit that day? Why is that my Friday?
No, but I guess it's manual.
All right.
We delayed by 5 minutes in coming back, and that was because it has been brought to my attention that some of the people inside this venue are not able to hear everything well. I'm made to understand that that is because of noise outside, and we were discussing what may be done to try and make sure that everyone who has taken the trouble to be here is able to hear everything. Something will be done. Whether it will succeed or not, we don't know. So I just want everybody to know that we are concerned if they are here and they can't hear everything that is being said. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Gordhan, before the short adjournment, we were dealing with the state of South African Airways, the swap transaction, the Airbus transaction, and then we proceeded to deal with the composition of the SAA board. The supplementary bundle at page 61 has some documentation that may be relevant. And that is a memorandum, or it's a cabinet memorandum that appears to have been declassified, that deals with the appointment and reappointment of directors to the Board of South African Airways. And I wanted to draw your attention to page 64 of that document, paragraph 5.10.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. You said 61, eh?
Yes, 61 is the Cabinet Memorandum 5 of 2016.
I don't seem to have page 61. Actually, for some reason, I don't have pages 33 to 65 in the supplementary bundle. If there is one that is complete, then I've got, is that complete? Okay, I'll use the registrar's one.
Thank you,
now.
Chair.
Thank you. Then maybe during the break. that
Yes,
can
during
be-
this break we will attend to it.
Okay, thank you.
Right, at page 64, Chair, do you have it, Minister?
Yes, I do.
The Cabinet Memorandum addressed by the Ministry of Finance to Cabinet in paragraph 5.10 refers to a period of 2 years during which the current chairperson would continue to occupy that position. Is there any explanation for the change from 2 years, as proposed, it appears, by the Ministry of Finance, and the compromise agreement of 1 year?
So, Chair, this is the CAB memo, which is the starting point of a discussion, either in a cabinet committee or in cabinet itself. I'm now not sure what the status of cabinet discussions is.
Well, I'm assuming, but Mr. Pretorius would know, I'm assuming that this has been declassified.
If you look at page 61, Minister, you will see there that the document was declassified on the 2nd of October 2018 by the Secretary of Cabinet.
No, I can see
now,
that.
That may permit...
It's not the document.
Oh, okay, you are thinking of other discussions other than what's written here.
The discussions that are pursuant on this cabinet memo being presented.
Well, let me put the question differently then. I understand your difficulty that release from classification, top secret or secret, of a document is one thing. The question is cabinet discussions around them. Let me make it clear that I will not ask you about cabinet discussions, but leading up to the 2-year proposal by Treasury that Ms. Mieni would continue and the 1-year outcome, were there any discussions outside of Cabinet between officials that may be relevant to that move from 2 years to 1 year?
So, Chair, as we say in paragraph 97, that there were discussions between presidency staff and National Treasury staff or officials during the process of compiling the final list of directors that were going to be proposed. So part of the discussion would have been the term of office of the chair, and that's reflected in the CAB memo. What we need is the cabinet minutes, which would record the outcome of this discussion. And as I recall it, we can check it for you, in terms of our records, the final agreement was 1 year.
And that would have been discussed in Cabinet and decided upon in Cabinet.
Aren't you putting him in a difficulty when you say in cabinet?
Well, in theory, such a decision would be made pursuant to a Cabinet memo without going into any detail.
Let me be an amateur lawyer, Chair, and submit the following, that if one gets a declassified set of minutes of this meeting, it would actually give you the result of the meeting.
If one looks at page 60, one will see there the minute of Cabinet that
Right.
I presume you're referring to.
Yes. Page-
Part of the minute, and under paragraph B, it reads, approved that Ms. D. Mieni be reappointed as chairperson of a board for a period of 1 year with a view to ensuring continuity and a seamless transition for the newly appointed board and deputy chairperson. But if I may run ahead a little, that's the decision. The question goes to the discussion leading up to the decision, and I understand your reservations in that regard.
So, Chair, that's the copy of a page of the Cabinet minutes, I would imagine, and it confirms what we've said.
Would you then deal, please, with the statement at paragraph 98 and 99, and in particular your relationship with investors during 2016?
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius and Mr. Gordhan. May I just take you back to paragraph 97 of your statement, which you just dealt with before we took the tea break. That paragraph indicates that there were discussions between the presidency and National Treasury, which resulted in the compromise that Ms. Mieni would continue as chairperson for 1 further year. Would the involvement of the presidency in the appointment or reappointment of members of boards of SOEs have been a normal thing? Is that a normal thing or not?
Not in the form, Chair, that this particular board demonstrates. So you'll see that the Cabinet memorandum at 61 is dated August. I was appointed in December. Let's leave December aside, take January. So that's what I said earlier on, Chair, that it took a formidable amount of time to get to this point where we had an agreed list. And let me clarify that from a Treasury point of view, our interest was not about the politics of the issue. And as we are now learning with the SOEs and SOE boards, that if we don't have the right combination of skills, integrity, and courage, because courage now becomes an important factor. You can actually see something going wrong, you can have a forensic report presented to you, but if one doesn't have the courage collectively or individually to take the necessary action to deal with malfeasance or poor corporate governance, then you would be failing, one would be failing in one's fiduciary responsibilities to that institution. So how do we put the best possible team together that has the experience. Now, the airline business is not replete with experience in our kind of context. It's a fairly narrow band of people. You will see that in the current SAA environment, which I inherited, the senior management team had to be supplemented by an international expert, Mr. Davies, who has, according to his records, turned around, so to speak, 5 other airlines. So he has the global perspective on airlines, the kind of experience of where the key touch points would be and what a turnaround plan would actually require. So our interest here was to ensure that we get the right skill set on the one hand, and the right leadership and integrity as well. Clearly there was resistance to that. And as perhaps the Commission goes into greater detail into some of the difficulties that SAA faced from, say, 2009 onwards, there were difficulties before then as well. It would encounter the kind of events and decisions made at a government level or at a board level or even at a management level, which presents us with the kind of difficulties that we actually have today. And we find that as a repeated phenomenon in other SOEs as well. So this was extraordinary. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps you could assist us then, Minister, in relation to the engagements between officials from the Presidency and officials from National Treasury, which obviously would have taken place outside of Cabinet. Who would be the person to assist the Commission?
Mr. Fuzila.
Okay, thank you. Then, if we may go to paragraph 98 of your statement, where you describe the meeting of the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland during January and February 2016. Would you deal with that, please?
With your permission, before I get to that point, Mr. Pretorius and Chair,
Yes.
can I introduce 2 elements of the issue we discussed earlier on, which is the point at which I was reintroduced into the Treasury, if I may. The first, I made reference to an announcement from the Presidency on Minister Nene's future in relation to the BRICS Bank. That apparently is at page 418 of your first bundle, just to help you in that regard. And the second point, Chair, is with reference to paragraph 80 at page 30 of the statement, which we skipped, and it reads, the decision also ushered in a period, that is the decision to bring in Mr. Van Rooyen, of close scrutiny of institutional stability and policy certainty by global ratings agencies. It's a point I made yesterday, that when, and I suppose this is a sign of the times globally as well, so we should not say that this is limited to South Africa, but we have our own specific issues that we deal with here, that the rating agencies would be more concerned in terms of their normal metrics and calculations about debt and about interest and about revenue and about your capability and willingness to pay debt off and so on. What this change in the position of Minister of Finance did was to bring about a new focus, which is institutional stability and policy certainty. So the policy certainty is the issue that at page 425 in the press statement on the changeover, which introduced me into the Treasury again, indicates the bottom of that page. But I think the point I want to draw to your attention is that this was the first signs of what the public narrative and our analysis was beginning to indicate at the time, that the Treasury was one of the key targets of state capture. And if one looks at the Gupta emails and all of the circumstances that surround Mr. Van Rooyen, then we begin to understand by virtue of his associations, that this was the first step in the takeover. And the particular interest that some of his people had shown, for example, in SAA and so on, is a reflection of that. And yesterday we also referred, if you remember, to the presentation prepared by the Treasury on the economic outlook being emailed in that 2-day period to outsiders. I think the email was read, here we have it, gentlemen, or something to that effect. So it was just to draw your attention to that before I get back to paragraph 98.
Thank you.
At 98, Chair, for some time now, it's if you like, tradition that during, I think it's usually the 3rd week of January, that the World Economic Forum meets in the very cold atmosphere of Davos. Why Davos, I don't know, and why we have to be there in snowbound Davos, I don't know either. But these meetings are an important opportunity for governments to present themselves to investors, ratings agencies, and attract investment into South Africa, but also create a positive narrative around a country. So in many years, particular governments will take over, inverted commas, or have a significant event. So leading up to the World Cup in 2010, South Africa was given a lot of prominence at Davos, just by way of illustration. 99 says that on that occasion, in early 2016, I was approached by South African business leaders, as an aside, at the WEF meeting for urgent discussions on how to avoid a sovereign credit rating downgrade and how to inspire confidence in the South African economy and government after the drastic and damaging changes at the Treasury. This resulted in an urgent meeting convened with business leaders upon my return to South Africa from WEF, and the CEO initiative was formed out of these engagements. So if you go back to 2016, you'll find that business, labor, civil society all became part of this process of, on the one hand, reintroducing confidence in our economy, secondly, demonstrating that the Treasury would do the right things in terms of the issues that are raised in that press statement, and that thirdly, there would be a contestation of any further moves on state capture in relation to the Treasury as well. This was followed by an investment roadshow by labor, government, and business representatives to overseas investors who are invested in our economy, and in particular in South Africa's debt during March 2016. I'll come back to that in a moment. At paragraph 101, we say, in addition, the CEO initiative launched a fund of 1.5 billion rands for supporting small business, particularly black-owned small businesses, as well as the Youth Employment Service as proposed and championed by the then Deputy President Ramaphosa, which will ensure that big business provide work and entrepreneurial opportunities to 1 million young people over a 3-year period. Further possibilities for additional investment in the South African economy were explored during these various initiatives as well. So, notwithstanding the fact that Minister van Rooyen was replaced on the 13th of December, this section articulates the concerns that the business sector had, and in particular concerns about what the credit rating agencies do, and that's in relation to paragraph 80 that I just read out. And if there was a downgrade, and essentially what a downgrade means, or what a credit rating means, is that it determines your credit worthiness. So how much of money can anyone lend this country or this individual with a sufficient sense of assurance that that money would actually be paid back as and when it is actually due. The lower the credit rating, the higher the interest rate you would pay. So the United States at one stage fell from a AAA to a AA, for example, but the other countries like Japan, because of the strength of their economy, I think still remain a AAA rating. But if you go to their debt to GDP, it's close to 200%. I think the number would still be approximately there at the current point in time. So depending on the strength of your economy and your ability and credit record, which is what any financial institution will do when you ask for credit, a home loan, a car loan, or whatever the case might be. So credit ratings are important, particularly if you borrow in a foreign environment, and but even in a local environment as well. In our case, as I remember the numbers, the foreign borrowing in foreign currency, that means in dollars or euros or yen, is limited to 10% of our overall borrowing. So that if there are fluctuations in the exchange rate, it doesn't have a significantly negative effect on the economy. There are many examples today around the world, particularly on the African continent, countries like Ghana and Zambia, when oil prices were high, borrowed a lot of money and began to spend it either in public servant salary increases or infrastructure projects and so on. And then the oil prices fell, and we're going south for some time, which means that their reliance on oil revenue wasn't going to enable them to pay back the loans that they had borrowed, and much of that borrowing was in foreign currency. So your currency depreciates. That means that where you would have originally paid, say, 10 units of your currency for $1, you can now say that you're going to pay 15 units of your currency to the dollar because of the depreciation in your currency. That means your debt burden actually increases quite significantly. And many of these countries then find themselves either at the doors of the Chinese government, and I'll explain why in a moment, or at the doors of the IMF, or sometimes the World Bank before the IMF. Now, even today, there's a stigma attached to getting any assistance from the IMF, because IMF's past history has been, we lend money to poor countries, but we also impose very harsh conditions, which generally means that social spending has to reach austerity levels, and that begins to impact on the local population. More recently, of course, the IMF has changed a bit, but the stigma still remains. So if you say that country X, like South Africa, is now borrowing money from the IMF or seeking loans from the IMF or seeking a facility from the IMF, meaning that you don't draw on the loan, but you have a facility that you can draw on if you need to, then you are now IMF dependent. And invariably, conditions begin to be attached to that loan as well. So coming back to the borrowing story, 10% maximum of our borrowing is in foreign currency, but even our rand-denominated bonds, that is money that we've raised locally, 40% of that is owned by foreigners. So if you create the wrong level of stability in the country, high levels of uncertainty, tomorrow morning bonds can be sold and the money can leave this country. So the Treasury, amongst other institutions, also monitors on a daily basis how much of money has come into bonds, into equities, or left bonds and left equities as well, so that it gives you some sense for what is going on. So the concerns that the CEO initiative had, or business people had, was about this set of issues. The second important point here is this was the first time that the normal roadshow is undertaken by Treasury and the South African Reserve Bank. It's the first time we actually have business and labor with us, so that you had Team South Africa going out. And that made quite an impact in March 2016. And that practice has continued up to a point and into the present as well. So that covers those two issues. But one of the things that we did at the CEO initiative is also to challenge the CEOs that they shouldn't just ask government to do X and Y. They themselves, as the business sector, need to come forward and demonstrate, firstly, their solidarity with communities that have not been part of the economy in an effective sense. And so the 1.5 billion rand fund was created. That money came in literally 2 to 3 months from corporate South Africa once the concept of the fund was clarified. And that fund went through some difficulties in the recent past, but it's operational now. Adrian Gore of Discovery, for example, and Brian Joffe are the two patrons of that fund, and there's a steering committee that then runs it. Equally, the initiative of President Ramaphosa on the 1 million jobs for young people is also quite a crucial one to get young people exposed to job opportunities and the work environment, and in a sense create some kind of CV.
We then get, Minister Gordhan, to the events, further events of your second term as Minister of Finance. And you deal in paragraph 102 and following of steps that were taken directly in relationship to yourself at the head of the, or at the hands of the law enforcement agencies. Would you deal with paragraph 102 and following, please?
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Pretorius, the 102 essentially makes reference to the famous 27 questions. And here, what we had in a week or so, say about 2 weeks prior to the budget in 2016, my office gets repeated calls from Mr. Ntlemeza to say that he wants to see me, even if it's for 5 minutes. So I accommodate that at some stage. And what he communicates in that discussion is that he wishes to inform me that there's some investigation going on in SARS and SAA. Doesn't give me any detail. He just wanted me to know. He'll return to me at some stage with more details, and he leaves. Then, in the week before the budget, again calls to my office from Mr. Ntlemeza. I don't know if generals keep their titles or not after they leave, so I refer to him as Mr. Saying that he needs to deliver an envelope directly to me. But we were obviously very busy in the final stages of preparing the budget documentation, as I explained yesterday. And at one stage, we, and by we I mean Mr. Jonas and I, were in the corridor, and we heard that there was yet another call. And if I recall, Mr. Jonas spoke to him to say, relax, can we finish the budget? We'll come and collect the envelope, whatever it is. We thought we had that agreement with him, but the next thing we have is the delivery of an envelope to Treasury.
Are you at paragraph 104?
Yeah.
Just before you go there, may I ask you a question about paragraph 103? You make the allegation there, the statement rather, that you believe that the capture of the Hawks under General Ntlemeza was central to the state capture project. Would you just outline to the Chair the reasons for that conclusion that you read?
Well, if we go back to the hypothesis around state capture and what I said in the early parts of yesterday, the capture of and repurposing, as the academics would call it, of key institutions is a crucial element of state capture. And apart from, let's call it, the set of extractive institutions, that is, institutions from which you're going to take money, the two other institutions that needed to be attended to, if you like, as part of the overall scheme would be your key investigating arm and your key prosecuting arm. I think my colleague, Mr. Taylor, would be able to give you a lot more details about the status of Hawks at the moment. But although I have no personal knowledge of this, from interactions with various people, what Mr. Ntlemeza did at the Hawks, which I described as a pattern earlier on in the statement, is in these institutions you just remove the good people at the top level and replace them. And rebuilding those institutions, as I said yesterday, means finding out who are the good people and who are the not so good people, who are committed to the cause of democracy and the proper management of investigations, and who's part of any form of ill intent or malfeasance, or serving the interests of those who want to engage in corruption arising from state capture. So the Hawks certainly, and that has been a feature over the last few years. Some so-called infringements are investigated, others are not. If you look at, for example, the conduct of, I think it's the General Ledwaba, in relation to SARS and accessing documents and victimizing Mr. Symington, who had a particular legal opinion, then that will be one illustration of the kind of activity that they actually engaged in. And there are many instances that are in the public record of the fact that in the early days of 2017, when the Gupta leaks first emerged, or even the Estina Dairy issue, which is the simplest of the transactions, by the way. And in money terms, well, it's 200 or 300 million rands that we're talking about, compared to the billions that have disappeared out of Transnet in relation to the locomotive transaction. At what stage are these investigations? And all of that, I think, amongst progressives in South Africa and those watching developments within the state, for them, it's quite clear that the Hawks have not been performing their role. And secondly, and far more importantly, they need to be strengthened once again, which is probably what Minister Thailele is doing, so that they can play their rightful investigative role.
Yes, you've raised questions, Minister, about the Gupta email leaks and the consequences or lack of consequences from an investigatorial and prosecutorial angle. Do you know what happened to the personnel in the Hawks under General Ntlemeza? You've given a general overview of changes in personnel. Have you any idea of the extent?
No, I think the
of the changes?
detail, Chair, would be available from people directly involved. All we have is a general understanding of the pattern that emerged.
You then were dealing with the delivery of the envelope to your officers on the 19th of February 2016. What happened then?
So I say in paragraph 104, Chair, that on or about the 19th of February 2016, that is the week before the budget, and budgets are had on a Wednesday, are delivered on a Wednesday, budget speeches. In the week before my budget speech, an envelope was hand-delivered to the Treasury by General Ntlemeza's, or at his insistence, I beg your pardon. This envelope contained 27 questions addressed to me from the Hawks and demanding that they be answered by 2 March 2016. The questions related to the high-risk investigations unit within SARS formed years earlier. Charges against me relating to that unit had been filed by Mr. Moyane on 15 May 2015.
Just before you continue, Minister, was the delay between the 15th of May 2015 and February 2016 in processing these charges ever explained to you?
No, but what it does bring to the fore, Chairperson, is one observation that I could have made earlier on, and that is that being appointed on the 13th of December 2015 is one thing in the midst of the turmoil. But fairly soon thereafter, from late January on, it was quite clear to me from various signals, this one in particular, and what followed this particular event, that a mistake had been made, inverted commas, in locating me at the Treasury, and that something needed to be done now to get rid of me. And my submission to you would be that some very harsh lessons were learned from the turmoil caused by the dismissal of Mr. Nene and the replacement of Mr. Nene by Mr. Van Rooyen, and whatever background he came from. And so you couldn't repeat that exercise of firing somebody again so soon thereafter. So other means needed to be found to, in essence, as you will see later, force me to resign. And pretty much the kind of bullying that we see at the moment is the kind of bullying and intimidation and harassment that the 27 questions and their delivery begin to introduce in our lives at the Treasury, but also in the lives of different persons, including myself. So, because there's no other explanation why for almost a year, a sitting president who actually appointed one to a particular position and said, you have a job to do, and that is to stabilize the markets. A month later or so, then allows his appointees to essentially start the process of harassment. And throughout the period between February and about October, November, the one narrative that I would hear is that this is all about forcing you to resign, and comrades within the ANC and colleagues within cabinet and people outside in civil society and the South African Communist Party and so on would say, don't resign. You have a job to do, and you've heard me say that on various platforms at that time. Do your job. And if he doesn't want you there, then he must fire you. And I think that for me is the context that we find ourselves in. And so where firing is not going to be a palatable option, and having learned from the turmoil and almost panicked during that turmoil of December 2015, a different formula needed to be found. And this securocratic formula is what was found to try to intimidate, harass, and literally chase one out of the office.
Given your understanding of the context within which these 27 questions were addressed to you, did you then approach President Zuma, former President Zuma?
Yes, I was obviously extremely upset, but also concerned at what was going on. And at 1:05, I say I arranged to visit the then president later that day, Thursday or Friday, to present the correspondence and questions from the Hawks to him and to ask him whether he was aware of and agreed with this law enforcement action against me. If I may continue, during that meeting, I objected strongly about this persecution, and asked former President Zuma whether political activists like myself must now prepare to be eliminated during the democratic era, even though we had survived the oppression, and I might say 3 different detentions in my case, under the security police in the apartheid era. In response to my objection, he merely flipped the pages of the letter. He said he would, finally said he would discuss the matter with the then Minister of Police, Mr. Nhleko. I received no information from the former president in this regard subsequent to this meeting. So what that describes, Chair, is I received the letter, I look at the questions, I'm concerned and angry about this particular form of intimidation that was going on, and angry particularly because anybody in government would know the importance of a budget speech and budget day in the welfare of the country as a whole. Now, who is it with what kind of mindset that would want to be disruptive on the Thursday or Friday before the budget, when we've got to finalize the budget documentation and the budget speech over that particular weekend? What kind of mindset actually informs you to say, I have to deliver this prior to the budget? Were they expecting that I would resign when I deliver the budget speech? I don't know, because the rest of the paragraphs that follow is about appealing to me not to do anything that would actually upset the country and investors and the well-being of the economy as well. So it's a fascinating question that I've never quite understood, except to say that this might be a bit of hubris and bullishness, replicating or mimicking in many ways the tactics of the previous security police that many of us, as you know, are familiar with. That regardless of consequences, regardless of context, we'll do whatever we feel like. And for those of us who are not too familiar with the security police of the past, a constable in the security police could dictate to a captain in the uniformed branch. And the uniformed branch would be literally scared of the security police. When we were in detention, you could actually see this interaction between the different players. So there was a unique set of powers on the one hand, but also authority, informally or formally, that the security police had. And that's the only explanation one can think about. Apparently, Mr. Ntlemeza had some background in the Transkei Security Police in his previous life.
When you raised this issue with the former president, does your statement say he did nothing more than just flip through the pages of the letter, or
Yes.
did he say anything?
Nope.
So your meeting lasted a very short time.
Yes.
He did say he would discuss the matter with the then Minister of Police.
That's on the record, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And then would you please deal with the meeting that you were called to on Monday, the 22nd of February 2016? This, as I understand your evidence, was shortly prior to the budget presentation in Parliament.
So, as I said yesterday, Chair, the budget documentation is completed the Friday night or Saturday morning, and then sent to the printers by late on Saturday. And there's a whole process of security and so on that's involved with that. Then the budget speech is prepared on the basis of the finalized numbers in the budget documentation, of which the budget review is the principal, if you like, overview text. And there's a thick book called Estimates of National Expenditure, which indicates what is allocated to each department and what their programs are that they will spend the money on. So there's a fair amount of complexity involved in preparing that document. So even by Monday, we will be finalizing, or up to Tuesday morning, we would be finalizing the budget speech. And what that involves is to take the numbers that are available and the kind of tax choices and other choices that government might have made, and provide a narrative which is consistent with the times. And as much as possible to create some optimism in the public mind and in the markets that we understand the context, B, we have a plan, C, we are working within the kind of frameworks that, particularly the fiscal framework that we had been pursuing before that, and D, indicate what the direction might be in numbers terms over a 3-year period. And those are all, of course, estimates, but there's a particular science and art, if you like, at that, because estimates very rarely become real in actual terms. So that's the context, and then, as I say in paragraph 109, I was requested to attend a meeting with the Secretary General, Mr. Mantash, Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Duarte, and Treasurer General, Dr. Mkhize of the ANC. I explained, I've got this speech to finish, and Mr. Mantash said, please come. So I took an afternoon flight from Cape Town, and then there was a meeting at a nearby hotel to the airport. And as I say here, I interrupted preparation for the budget and flew to Johannesburg from Cape Town to meet them that afternoon. The 27 questions and this abuse of law enforcement powers for political objectives was discussed with them. I was assured that a political solution would be found to this political problem. Now, essentially, this was about tempering or preempting what they thought might be an excessive reaction to the 27 questions. So I assured them that as somebody who tries to always take account of national interest, we would not deliberately play a disruptive role. But at the same time, the 27 questions are unwelcome and clearly designed for political purposes to harass one, although the full context would become clearer in the months that actually followed. What's fascinating is the next paragraph, that this was correspondence and a set of questions directed to me, which I then gave to the lawyers to deal with.
I'm sorry, before you get to that paragraph, let's just go back to that last sentence of paragraph 109. It says, I was assured that a political solution will be found to the political problem. Would I be right to deduce from this sentence that those that were at that meeting seemed or took the matter, the problem, as being a political problem rather than anything else, or is it just your own description?
Well, it's a political problem, Chair, in the sense that here you have one arm of the state attacking another arm of the state without any clear basis for that. And that it had long been proven by then that the kind of events that they wanted to cover in the 27 questions had very logical, reasonable, and legal answers to all of those questions that were available, both in the public domain and otherwise. So yes, it was a political solution, or a political problem, in the sense that, yes, under a particular president, you have a Minister of Finance who's got a critical role to play in a few days' time, not on his own personal behalf, but on behalf of government, being tampered around in this kind of way, and that this could lead to serious disorientation. Now imagine going back to the whole Treasury team, which we didn't do, by the way, and saying, look, this is the kind of pressure we are under. And what happens on that Wednesday morning, if I may just take a minute to advise you, Chair, is that on Wednesday from about 6 o'clock on budget day, journalists, some of them might be here, actually come to Parliament. They have their cell phones taken away. Their computers don't have any transmission devices or facility on them. They're then given, they get into a lockup until 2 o'clock, and they then are given a set of the budget documentation. From about 7:30 onwards, officials walk around amongst the journalists to help them with answers to any questions that they might need clarity on, technically and otherwise. Sometimes we ourselves used to do that as well. At about 10:30, those officials come back to the minister's office and say, look, these are the 5 or 6 top questions that we were asked. At about 10:30 or 11, we have a press conference with the journalists that's embargoed, so they can't write anything. I mean, they can't transmit anything, but they can start writing their stories and prepare their stories in advance. And we take questions from the journalists as well. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the words Madam Speaker or Mr. Speaker are articulated, is when they can press the button and transmit their story. So that's the context on a Wednesday. which means that you want, if you like, maximum sanity and stability in that environment to be able to give the right kind of answers in all those different fora that we have to actually appear.
Thank you. Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. In paragraph 110, you say that the 27 questions were leaked to the media the day after the budget. I'd like to just deal very briefly and at a very general level with the 27 questions themselves. Obviously, it's not appropriate at this stage to go into the merits and demerits of all the issues that were raised in the 27 questions. But do you have a general comment on the content of the questions and why you reached the conclusion that it was improper to visit these questions upon you?
Well, the first point, Chair, is that which I was beginning to make when I was taken back to 109 in 110, is that here you have a letter and questions directed from the Hawks to myself. And as I indicated, I then hand them to lawyers. And one would expect that that remains in the confidential domain. But that Thursday, which is immediately after the Wednesday budget speech delivery, the 27 questions and I think the correspondence were then leaked to the media, which means that there's an agenda. And then subsequent correspondence was also leaked, and prior to this there was a pattern of leaking as well in relation to other issues. So who were the forces that were managing all of this is an intriguing question for the Commission to look into, because clearly there was some orchestration going on. And if one wants to now regularly leak information as opposed to give either the recipient or themselves an opportunity to address in a fair and objective way these sorts of issues with the public, then one must ask what sinister motives are actually guiding the people concerned. So you can see amongst the questions, were you briefed on the strategic operations of the unit? Do you know anything about Sunday evenings, which is still the subject of another prosecution?
Just before you go on, Minister, the questions themselves appear for record purposes at page 432 of the bundle N1B. But in any event, at page 432 of the bundle, I'm informed that it's part of the second bundle, N1B, not the supplementary bundle. I have it in N1A, but be that as it may, it's at page 432, Chair.
So the exhibit in which the questions appear is exhibit what?
Give me 431.
I think somebody on your left wants to give you the answer.
Well, because I intend not to be ruled by the majority in this case. May I, it's annexure 20, and my informant on my left was correct, I must defer.
Which exhibit first?
Well, it's not all the same, but N1B, I'm informed.
Is it not one of the 6 that we have always
Yes, it
had
is.
since yesterday?
It's one of those. It's the second one.
And didn't you say they are all marked now?
Yes,
Thought
I
you
did.
said so?
And if they're not, I take full responsibility.
Well, there's exhibit N1C. That is not the one.
N1B,
N1B.
yes, please. Page 429.
Okay. Okay. What is the page again?
Thank you, Chair. Page 430 is the beginning of the press article, but it lists the questions according to the press article verbatim at page 432.
Okay, I've got it.
Do you have that list before you?
Yes, I do.
Just generally, and without going to the merits of each and every question, otherwise we'll be here for months.
You will be.
In any event. The scope of the questions, what issues generally did they deal with? Had these issues surfaced before? Had they been dealt with? If you could just deal with it in that light, please.
No, the issues had surfaced before. I don't have all the information in front of me, but you recall me making reference to leaks to the Sunday Times chair and the apology that subsequently followed when editors changed from Ms. Oppelt to the current editor. And there are many books and so on available now which demonstrate the malfeasance that actually underpinned the leak stories. For example, I mean, we've had references to shebeens on the one hand, but you also had references to brothels on the other hand. Neither could be discovered, interestingly. So that's just one illustration of, if you like, a security operation of one kind or another. The second is, if you take some of the latter questions pertaining to Mr. Pillay, who was then Deputy Commissioner at SARS. Now, so the 27 questions, there was a leak again to the Sunday Times about this issue. Then it appears in the 27 questions. Then it was the subject of formal charges from the NPA on the 11th of October 2016, which charges were withdrawn on the 31st of October 2016. And later in the statement, I indicate to you that now the public protector wants to look at the same issues as well. So what's going on? These are simple legal matters where there's an immense amount of clarity on what is right and what is wrong. And when you are at a deficit in terms of finding plausible reasons to do the kind of things that you want to do, then you really scrape the bottom of the barrel, including using slogans developed by Bell Pottinger and so on. So that's in the Gupta emails as well. It's not my concoction. So what the conclusion one can come to following this, I mean, I've had family members who have had demonstrations in front of their house by some of the protagonists of the views that I'm talking about. What for? If I'm just an ordinary guy, forgive the colloquialism again, doing a piece of work, nobody can find any fault with what I'm doing or my team is doing, and we are doing collectively. Why all this narrative and actions that we actually see to attempt to bully and intimidate and misinform the public, an issue that I'll come back to later. So the short answer to the question, Mr. Pretorius and Chair, would be that those would be the reasons that I suggest underpin the 27 questions and whatever follows.
As I understand your evidence, if I may summarize, you regarded the subject matter of the charges as being matters which had been raised, questions had been answered, and as I understand your evidence, you say that that was an abuse of power. Is that correct?
Yes.
Is there not an argument that could be put to you that these were genuine investigations in relation to matters of potential unlawful activity?
You know, there's a term, Chair, that Bill Clinton was, I think, made famous for. It's the economy is stupid, meaning, you know, you've got to look at a wider set of issues when one answers a question like that. So what's the context? Context matters. You're not looking at one isolated issue in its own right and saying, is this a possible, if it was just that, then it's very easy to accept the bona fides of a general inquiry. We just want to know from you, can you give us any more clarity about X and Y and Z? Oh, you'll be welcome, you'll get a cup of tea, and we'll talk about it as the public protector did, the previous one, and we'll give you the information that we have, or I have, in a particular regard. Why all this intrigue? Delivering envelopes prior to the budget, leaking the letter, etc., and what follows later on the same subject matter. So there's a consistency both in the narrative and in the actions that are actually taken. So there has to be something more than just a genuine inquiry, if one can call it that.
We could then move on to your evidence, thank you, Minister, at paragraph 114.1, where you deal with an issue that is encapsulated in paragraph 1.7 of our terms of reference, and about which evidence will be given later this week, and that is the appointment of advisors to Mr. Nene's replacement, Mr. Van Rooyen.
Well, before you go there, Mr. Pretorius, Minister, at paragraph 111 of your statement, you mentioned that State Security Minister Mr. David Mahlobo and Minister Nhleko held a joint press conference on 2 March 2016 defending the investigation and the timing of the questions posed to me by the Hawks. Maybe I can understand Mr. Nhleko there, but why would Mr. Mahlobo have been there? He's not Minister of Police. Do you know?
It's a good question, Chair, and I was going to take Mr. Pretorius back to it in two respects. One is in respect of what you've just said. So why is the State Security Minister always present, if one puts it very euphemistically, when these sorts of occurrences arise? And it's a fair question to ask. And the second is that we had in fact prepared for the Commission Chair clips of these press conferences to demonstrate A, the language used, B, the explanations offered. And in this particular instance, it was a cabinet meeting at which all of us were present. And the cabinet meeting ends, and suddenly I'm told that these two ministers are having a press conference. So it's about what? No, it's something to do with these matters around the 27 questions. So only later, of course, I hear what they have had to say. But again, it provides further evidence that this was not just a gentle academic, objective legal inquiry that we were talking about. Why must two ministers actually get involved? If you are leaving it to a law enforcement agency to do its work in an objective and legal way, and even if there are criticisms, let the agency defend itself or explain its conduct in whatever way it might actually want to explain its conduct. But you had this particular press conference. Now, there was an apprehension on the side of the legal team that if we attempt to show the clip. Maybe the technology might not be able to cope. But during lunch, we could see, if you want to, Chair, whether we could get the technology to work so that, or you could view it in your own time, because we have, what do you call these things? Links to YouTube videos, which you could look at.
We have downloaded those, which are
Yes.
available for viewing if we have time.
Okay. One would have expected that, well, maybe I shouldn't say one would have expected. Did you expect that if Mr. Ntlemeza was to serve you with those kinds of questions, is it something you would have expected your colleague in cabinet for the police to, as a matter of courtesy, mention to you? Is it something that you expected he would have known about, or not really? It might be difficult to say.
It's a good question, Chair. I think there's nothing illegal with saying that I'm sorry, but this agency is looking into this matter, and you can expect X. I'm not involved in the investigation. I'm not involved in the detail, but they will explain to you whatever they need to do. So please cooperate with them, or whatever the case is. So that certainly is a collegial courtesy that could be extended if there's the will to do so.
And before the two ministers held the press conference, they did not speak to you about these questions, these 27 questions?
No.
Okay, thank you.
You've related, Minister Gordhan, the fact that you were called to a meeting days before you were due to present the budget speech on the 22nd of February. You've related the manner in which the questions were delivered. Just to round off that evidence, at page 442 of bundle N1B, is the press record of the press conference to which you've just referred.
Yes.
The chair asked about the involvement of the Minister of State Security, and a remark is made then on the second page of that report at page 443, the penultimate paragraph, which begins, "on the other hand." Would you please read that paragraph onto the record?
Sure. Chair, it reads, "On the other hand, the Minister of State Security, David Mashlobo, who sat next to Nhleko, was as cool as a cucumber, inscrutable as one would expect from a man who holds a lot of secrets. He calmly waited as the Minister of Police read out a patchy history of the apparent origins of the rogue unit saga, adding that the Hawks' questions to Finance Minister Gordhan did not mean he himself is facing an investigation or is even being charged. This is disingenuous because I was charged eventually." That's the close of the quotation.
Is it correct? I really wanted to draw the chair's attention to the reported allegation, and I stress that it is a reported allegation, that the investigation or charges were non-existent. You say that's not correct,
The charges were, sorry?
that you had not been charged. As I understand it, there had been a charge previously,
Not previously, subsequently.
subsequently. The Mayani,
You mean the laying of a charge, Chair?
yes, the charges
Yeah,
that were brought against you and filed by Mr. Mayani
in May.
were in May 2015.
That's right. I
These
only
events
became
were
aware of
happening
that
in
much later.
2016.
Okay, I think the two of you spoke at the same time.
I beg your pardon.
I'm sorry.
But I think you wanted to give the time when something happened in May.
So I think Mr. Pretorius's question, sorry, my apologies for interjecting in that way. Mr. Pretorius's question is with reference to a charge laid by Mr. Moyane at the Brooklyn police station sometime in May 2015. I'm referring to the charges lodged or delivered to us on the 11th of October 2016 by the NPA.
Nevertheless, they covered the same material, at least in part.
Same material. May I, if you don't mind, before we skip to 114, at 113, Chair,
Yes.
may I read the latter part of, or maybe the whole of 113? This set of events, combined with what is set out below, was the beginning of what appeared to be a campaign to force me to resign as Minister of Finance and continue the efforts to capture the Treasury thereafter. I believe that my reappointment had thwarted these efforts, and I believe Mr. Nene was removed from the National Executive for the same reason, to obtain full control of the Treasury. Now, I want to, if I may, Mr. Pretorius and Chair, draw your attention to annexure, might be 23. I beg your pardon, Chair, or it's actually attached to some of the other documents, but page 473 of bundle N1B.
The one we
right?
just used. The one we just used.
Yes,
Yeah.
It's annexure
So,
22.
yes.
So what is the page?
473.
473. Thank you.
And this is also important, Chair, for the record, because it fits into the conversation or engagement we've just had on this matter. May I just read some paragraphs here?
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. The recent media reports about my arrest, so there were also media reports about me getting arrested, imminent or not, have been extremely distressing for my family and me. I cannot believe that I am being investigated and could possibly be charged for something I am completely innocent of. I have answered the questions submitted by the Hawks, as you pointed out, Chair, and I have not heard from them. I was not aware of any impending charges or further investigations until the reports in the past weekend. It is indeed true that no one is above the law, but no one should be subjected to the manipulation of the law and agencies for ulterior motives. Throughout my 45 years of activism, I have worked for the advancement of the ANC, our constitution, and our democratic government. I would never have thought that individuals within the very agencies of this government would now conspire to intimidate and harass me and my family. I have met with my lawyers to obtain their advice. They will be approaching the leadership of both the Hawks and the NPA for further information and clarity. I worked to get, the next paragraph refers to the work we did at SARS. The malicious rumors and accusations about espionage activities are false and manufactured for other motives. There have also been reports of business people claiming inside knowledge of or influence over state institutions. If such reports are true, that alleged conduct will undermine the integrity and honesty within the Treasury and key institutions. It's particularly painful to me, and I'm sure to many earnest Democrats, to witness this unrestrained attack on honest and hardworking people and institutions meant to strengthen our democracy. Millions of people will pay the price. There will be less money to relieve poverty and support job creation programs if this subversion of democracy is left unrestrained and unchallenged. I appeal to all South Africans to protect the National Treasury staff, who have diligently, honestly, and skillfully serve the national interest to the best of their ability. They are recognized worldwide for their professionalism and competence. So that also gives you some context and the kind of concerns that were prevalent at the time, both at a personal level, but at more importantly at an institutional level as well.
That document from which you've read is a media statement made by yourself as Minister of Finance on the 17th of May, 2016.
That's right.
You have made this statement before you referred to that press statement, Minister, in paragraph 113 about how you saw and how you regarded what you have described as a campaign to force you to resign. In paragraph 114, you provide some detail in relation, I presume, to that understanding of the events yourself. Or
Again, Chair,
yourself.
if I can just read this. I refer the Commission to the contents of subsequent media reports that reveal that shareholders in Gupta-linked consultancy group Trillion allegedly were warned in advance, or rather informed in advance, that Mr. Nene would be fired as Finance Minister, and that Trillion, the company, planned to exploit access to the Treasury under Mr. Nene's replacement, Mr. Van Rooyen. Mr. Eric Wood, Trillion's Chief Executive Officer at the time, denied the allegations and suggestions that he, Trillion, and other Gupta-connected individuals had profited from the market turmoil that followed Mr. Nene's removal. Evidence provided by a Trillion whistleblower to the parliamentary inquiry into Eskom established that Wood may have profited thanks to his prior knowledge of the removal of Mr. Nene. That witness is a lady, Ms. Masilo Motepu, who was very courageous to be a whistleblower and made her appearance at the parliamentary inquiry. The Commission will benefit from her evidence to you as well. Similarly, Advocate Budlander, sorry.
I'm sorry. Would the legal team have the name already, or?
Yes, we have the statement.
Oh, you've got a statement.
The statement was presented to Advocate Budlander in his inquiry, and findings were made by Advocate Budlander. But let's just put it in context, Minister. The evidence to the parliamentary inquiry into Eskom was given whilst you were in Parliament, as I understand it. Were you present when that evidence was given?
Yes.
If I may refer you to page 475 of bundle N1B. This article refers to the version of Eric Wood in relation to that evidence.
That's correct.
Just for record purposes. Chair, I'm informed by the minority that it's almost 1 o'clock, and perhaps this is an appropriate time.
And do you allow yourself this time to be ruled by the minority?
A whole 2 minutes before 1, please.
Okay, thank you. We are going to take the lunch adjournment, and we will resume at 2 o'clock.
Thank you, Chair.
We adjourn.
I see the camera missed the point.
Yeah.
Missed the opportunity.
You must take my notes seriously. They don't help me. And if I tell you a number, I'm correct. 189%.
Which is frustrating.